Okay, welcome APUSH students to your Chapter 6 review video here. We're going to talk directly about the Revolutionary War and the governments following soon after. Our time period, as you can see there, 1776, Declaration of Independence, to 1789, the emergence of the Constitution. All right, let's get in it. Okay, so trials of war here. The war, of course, is going to break out in the north, and Britain's military is vastly more numerous than what the Americans, what the Patriots can come up with. A lot of the Native American groups surrounding these colonial areas, of course, sided with the British because they were hoping that the British could curb the colonial dream of expansion into the West. Obviously, they're going to pick the wrong side. They're Lexington, Concord are the battles that start this war. AP doesn't focus on battles, but there are a few you should know for the war because there are consequences. The Battle of Saratoga is important because it's a turning point in the war that convinces France that America is a place that could possibly beat Britain with the aid of France, of course. And so it's going to convince them to actually jump on board and make this alliance, this Franco-American alliance, which we could not have won the Revolutionary War without. The French gave us money, they gave us weapons, and while it was late, towards the end of the war, they gave us directly men here to fight the battle. Now, remember that they are actually fighting, the French are fighting the British over in Europe. So that is, Britain is basically fighting a two-front war here. Okay. Women play an important role in this, everywhere from creating clothing that used to be bought from Britain, but they're doing men's jobs while the men are away. They're taking care of farms. They're administering slaves. They're dealing with tenants. They're doing all of these things, everything that a man would do, because thousands of men are no longer in their homes because they're out there fighting this war. Now, there's a tremendous financial crisis in the colonies. You've got each state has their own currency, and their currency is very highly inflated. So you have a lot of financial issues there. But Robert Morris, who's the chief treasury here, would end up securing valuable aid from Holland and France that would help us financially. Although we're still going to struggle for a little bit. Excuse me. Valley Forge, one of these almost American legends, this issue. This is George Washington's winter camp, Valley Forge, one of the coldest winters in American history, on record anyway. And Baron von Steuben, who was a former Prussian military officer, so he's basically German, he helped train the American army there. And George listens to him. He takes his advice. They dig latrines away from the camp and stuff to help sickness. Valley Forge is also where smallpox breaks out, and George Washington does this awesome, a trick he learned from the slaves, actually, on how to inoculate against smallpox. And he forced his men. He would take somebody infected with smallpox and make some cuts on them, and then he would force the men to get this weakened version of the virus, and he would cut the men who aren't infected and infect them with the smallpox. But it's a vaccine. It's a weakened version of the smallpox. And they lost, I think, some 50 men, but they would have lost to smallpox, but they would have lost thousands to smallpox. It would have ended his army. It would have ended the revolution without a doubt. So they saved a day there. All right, French alliance, again, incredibly important, also highly unusual because of how Catholic the French monarchy was. We're certainly, although we have Maryland and a few Catholic enclaves here, we are certainly not a Catholic nation. Ben Franklin is our liaison to France. He's over in France doing his best to win their help to our cause. And thanks to his actions over there, he's going to ensure the independence of the United States. Remember, Franklin is the most famous American in the world, until George Washington, really. All right, the war in the South, it takes a little bit longer to get there, but it does eventually happen. So you also have Spain fighting against Britain. So, we've kind of been led to believe that we went toe to toe with Britain by ourselves and defeated them. And that's not really the truth. We did have aid from others, or it just really wouldn't have been possible probably to beat the British. Not in that time period anyway. Perhaps later as we grew in strength and power, but not then. All right, so Britain's Southern strategy. The South doesn't have as many people fighting for the war because if you have your men leave the plantation to go fight in the war, who's watching the slaves? Who's ensuring that the slaves stay on the plantations? So that was a fear. And so, they just were unwilling to send as many men. Now, the Philipsburg Proclamation basically gives the slaves freedom if they fight on the side of the colonies. And there were some slaves that took up on this. As you see there, 5,000 African Americans, free and slave, fought for the Patriot cause. And some of them did win their freedom, and some of them did not. Some of them were forced right back into slavery when it was all said and done. So they were cheated, basically. Another important figure from overseas in the American Revolution was the Marquis de Lafayette. He's very instrumental in getting French troops. He finally convinces France to land a few troops in America to help us deal the decisive blow. And in the South, you're seeing a lot of guerrilla warfare. If you've ever seen the movie Patriot, it's along those lines. They're fighting like Indians fight. They can't beat the British toe to toe, line to line in an open battlefield. But what they can do is raid and skirmish. They targeted officers, which was a big no-no in the rules of warfare. The idea being that if you shot the officers, it would all dissolve into chaos. That the officers were the only thing keeping it civil as war can actually be, I guess. But they didn't care. They're trying to win in the South. Now, it doesn't say it here, but an important battle that you should know is Yorktown. Yorktown happens in 1781, and George Washington is closing in on Lord Cornwallis, who's like the overall commander of the revolutionary or the British forces. And here come the French finally, and they surround them at Yorktown. They bombard them, shell them, and eventually Cornwallis is forced to surrender. It'll take 2 years before we get the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which will give us, our country, officially our country. Now, during that time, we're trying to create a new government, a Republican institution, if you will. But the question is, how much democracy should we be going? We know that we're experimenting. We know that we're tired of what we felt like Britain did to us. They tyrannized us. And so we're trying something new. We're trying something different based off the ideals of the Enlightenment and Greco-Roman influences and things like that. But how much democracy should we have? Well, Pennsylvania, they had the most controversial constitution. It was the most free constitution of any of them, most democratic of any of the states. It was unicameral legislature, meaning it had one house. There was not like we have today. We have a bicameral legislature, but Pennsylvania only had one. It was created with no power, but they had no governor. It was all legislative. You didn't really have an executive person that could gain power and gain too much influence. But other states tended to create bicameral legislatures, and most states were not truly democratic. Only Pennsylvania and Vermont were really, what we would think of as democratic. But, we'll talk about that. Women were also seeking a public voice. The most famous, of course, was Abigail Adams, who, her husband was a big dog and would eventually become the second president of the United States. And so she was, she wrote this famous letter to him saying, remember the ladies, remember what we did during the great cause. Don't forget us, your speeches about being equal and being tyrannized and things like that. Don't let that happen to us. Sort of fell on deaf ears, but it is really one of the first big parts of the women's movement in America. And it'll put us on a road that will eventually lead in freedom for women in America. So basically, following the Revolutionary War, only white men were full citizens in the new government, which doesn't sound very democratic. It doesn't sound very American, but understand it is still more democratic than what's going on in the rest of the world. So don't compare it to modern standards. Compare it to the standards in which it exists. And under those standards, we're an experiment. I mean, to think that a poor white dude can vote, I mean, that's just unheard of in Europe. Now, who are the losers of the war? Well, there are several camps of losers. Loyalists, of course, who are going to have most of their property confiscated and stolen. Many loyalists will basically be exiled or self-exiled. Some will go back to Britain, where, you know, they're in a strange place to them. They've never been there, and it's different than what they had imagined. Many others, some 60,000 or so, went to Canada, and which is still under the control of Britain. So they can go back to Britain. They stayed in the Americas, but they get to keep the government that they wanted, that they're used to. Native Americans, of course, were the losers because now you have a new government that is hostile to you, that wants what you have, your lands, and that is focused on westward expansion, something we're going to call manifest destiny. So they're definitely losers in all of this. And the slaves are losers, without a doubt, because as we expand west and gain new grounds for cash crops such as cotton, we've been really tobacco and indigo and some rice and things like that, but we're going to expand into cotton, which is very labor intensive. So it's going to be bad for the slaves. Many loyalists suffered economically. Others fled. We said these things, and slaves did not gain their freedom after the war. Now, our very first government, most people don't realize, wasn't the Constitution. Rather, it was something called the Articles of Confederation. We'll typically shorten that to AOC. The AOC created a weak central government. It's the states that have all the power, and that can be a problem when you have too many chiefs and not enough Indians. It's really hard to get anything passed. Each state has one equal vote in this national government, and in order to amend the articles to make an amendment, you have to have unanimous approval. Well, there's always a Rhode Island or somebody crazy out there like that that refuses to go along with what the others want, and so it's really hard to get anything done. Now, what can the federal government do? Well, they could make treaties. That's something they could do. They could borrow money, and they could ask for tax dollars. They could not demand tax dollars. And that's a problem when you're trying to pay off war debts and you've got new states that won't pay it. You know, you had some states that paid off war debt very quickly and other states who don't get around to doing that. And the power to not tax it really makes the Articles of Confederation very weak. And the fact that they don't really have an executive body also gives it a weakness as well. An important thing that passes during the AOC days, I guess the one success of the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance. It's certainly something you need to know. It's going to ban slavery in the Northwest Territory. And, they're chopping up land and selling it, and some of that money would go towards education, which is great. Our country's slowly going to move towards the importance of education. Territories could apply for statehood when they reach 60,000 people. That's important. And the Northwest Ordinance, like I said, it's going to set the scene for slavery in the South and non-slavery in the North. This thing that's going to occupy so much of our energy and attention leading up to the Civil War. And it also sets up the frameworks for call it new territories becoming state. Once you reach 60,000 people, you can apply for statehood. You can create a state constitution. And if the government accepts you into the nation, you will become a new state. Also following the Revolutionary War, you have some issues. You have a rebellion here, Shays Rebellion. Massachusetts state legislature increased taxes. Again, we're all trying to pay for debt and stuff. Many farms were foreclosed on. And you have this Revolutionary War vet, Daniel Shays, who leads a rebellion and says, hey, you're doing exactly to us what the British did to us before. You're no different. You're just closer. This also demonstrated the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and how you would deal with this. And a very important consequence of Shays' rebellion is it helped people realize we have to have a new government, they're so afraid of a strong central government that they've created this very weak government it just isn't good enough. And Shays' rebellion is going to say, listen, we're going to have to make a stronger national government. So sectional differences slowly emerged. Northerners tended to favor tariffs. Southerners did not. Northerners are beginning to manufacture our own goods, And so they want to place tariffs on British goods and other goods from out of country so as to prop up their industries, to protect them, to even out the playing field, to make it more competitive for them. However, that means that the South would have to pay more money for foreign goods than what they were paying before, or they would have to pay for more expensive Northern goods. A very important issue you need to understand. And it's going to help also put us on the road to the Revolutionary War, which, while the central meaning behind the Civil War, behind the Civil War is slavery, there are other issues, and one of them is the economic system here in America, which the Southerners feel like they're getting gypped on. All right, the Philadelphia Convention puts 55 delegates who were, of course, mostly wealthy and upper class. Some famous names that weren't there: Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. So that's strange. Of course, George Washington was elected as president of the convention. And during this convention, which is steaming hot, it's during the summer, it's super hot. They come up with they basically divide up into two separate plans. The Virginia plan, which is the big states plan, and the New Jersey plan, which is the small states plan. The Virginia plan proposed a bicameral legislature where representation in Congress was to be based on population. So it's based on population. So bigger states would have more power. That's how the bigger states want it. They feel like they have more influence. They're bigger. They're more important. The New Jersey and the small states plan, however, wants more equality. So they want representation that would be equal for each state. One vote per state or two votes per state. What we end up with after some Jack and John here is the Great Compromise, which combines elements of both of these plans. It creates a bicameral legislature, the one you're familiar with now, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives will be based on population. It's elected by the people. The upper house would be the Senate, which is two per state, so the equality there, and it would be elected by the state legislatures. Now, later on in American history, that will change, and senators will be directly elected by the people as we become a nation moving towards more democracy. But that will be later. There's some issues over slavery because how we count population. Southern states want slaves to count as their population. Northern states don't want to give away their power to Southern states, and they say you don't consider them human, so why should they vote for your population? And so we get Henry Clay, the great compromiser, one of the first many compromises he brokers. We're going to say, okay, 3 out of 5 slaves will count towards the population for representation in Congress. So that's an advantage for the South. And you're going to see that early on. The South gets many advantages that the North does not like. Many of your early presidents were from the South, especially Virginia. We get more national authority, and we get a new government called the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And there you have the Constitution was not easily ratified. There was a lot of debate that went on. There was a lot of things that had to be done to convince people to accept the Constitution. Now, the Constitution would take effect when 9 out of the 13 states ratified it. And what we got was 2 camps, as you can imagine. You had a group of people called the Federalists who want this stronger federal government, who favor ratification. And you get the Anti-Federalists who they worry about such a strong national government. And Anti-Federalists criticize the lack of a Bill of Rights. They want rights that can't be trampled on by a new, powerful central government. So the Federalists respond to that, and they write something anonymously called the Federalist Papers. John Jay, Madison, and Hamilton were 3 of the big names that wrote in the Federalist Papers, which is a series of 85 essays that would appear in local papers to trying to convince people to ratify the Constitution. Now, what's really going to get the Constitution ratified is the promise of the Bill of Rights. When the Bill of Rights comes along, the other people, they're willing to go along with it. Now, the Anti-Federalists are willing to go along with it. Typically, people in the back country were Anti-Federalists, and Easterners were Federalist. Okay? All right. Pretty quick and easy. So remember the Battle of Saratoga and how it's a turning point? It's going to get us that Franco-American alliance that is so essential to our victory. We had foreign assistance from Spain, Holland, and France. We're not going it alone in the revolution. While we're the ones going to bear the heaviest losses and stuff, we still did have help from the outside. Women, natives, and African Americans did not gain rights after the Revolutionary War, but the Revolutionary War is going to put democracy in women's minds, in slaves' minds, and they're going to use that for the next big issue, which will be the Civil War. Shays' Rebellion taught us that we needed a stronger government, one that could deal with uprisings and insurrections. The Articles of Confederation that was our first government, and it had a lot of weaknesses. The biggest weakness being that it had no executive body and it could not directly tax its citizens. The Northwest Land Ordinance basically set up the template for gaining statehood for new territories. It also banned slavery in that territory and kind of set us up north versus south. The New Jersey and Virginia plans, the small state and the big state plans there, and the Great Compromise, the 3/5 compromises, all of that to get us towards this new and better government called the Constitution, which had, arisen with these two groups, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Bill of Rights secures the deal, and in 1787, we're going to get the Constitution of the United States. Okay, guys, thanks.